Hello and welcome back to Speak Damon Painting, where today we are taking a look at making some of the most basic wargaming terrains you can find, and those are some rocky outcrops. They're always handy to have in any game system because they are great things for your models to take cover behind and to break up line of sight a bit whenever possible. Now, in order to make these things, we're going to be making use of simple XPS boards. I got these, they're about, 7 centimeters thick or so, and the first stage is just marking out the general shape of the rocky outcrops that I want to make. And you have to free them from the foam, and I do this by simply making a couple of cuts with my box cutter here, and score along so that I sort of miss the big shapes of the island, and do this a couple of times until the foam is actually weak enough for me to just snap off, and so you can continue making more precision cuts later on. Now, sometimes you can't just make one cut to get these things out of the foam board. You'll have to make two, but again, this isn't too tricky. Just make sure that you keep making a first scoring in the foam, and then just continue putting some pressure on your blade until you are deep enough for you to just snap it off, so you can make the detail cuts later on. This is pretty much what you end up with after you've cut out all of the basic shapes, and now it's just a matter of going around and refining it. Make sure that you're always cutting away from yourself though, because you don't want to end up with any nasty battle scars over your terrain. And yeah, voila, this is one cut out, and just going around it with a knife. You don't need any fancy equipment to make these, but if you have got a foam cutter like I do, you can make you can save a bit of time rather, like I did here, and you're also less stuck with a bit less of a mess afterwards. You do get a different finish when using the foam cutter, but that's not really a problem because we'll be working on our texture now. You start off, or I start off with this, by making a few vertical cuts into the foam block at this point, just so I have some smaller areas I can work on and work more targeted as well. Once I've made the vertical cuts, I'm essentially just digging in with my knife, and rather than cutting, I'm mostly breaking and peeling off bits of the foam at this stage. And I try to do so in as irregular a pattern as I can. It also creates some nice striations for your final texture, and you can just keep going until you end up with a result that you really like. Foam is very easy to cut away, and you should never be afraid to take off more rather than less, because, well, you want to avoid that this is just a block of foam look, and a few precision cuts here and there are advised, like I'm doing here, but otherwise it's just mostly a case of plonk bits away from it. You can see me working on a corner piece here. It goes reasonably fast after you've got the hang of it, and I think all in all, getting around to this whole block took me about, 10 minutes or so before the whole thing was plonked away. You start off being extremely precise, but as time goes on you just get messier and messier with the whole thing. And as you can tell, this is starting to look somewhat like a rock, but it still has that sort of spongy, foamy texture that you get with, well, obviously, foam. Another thing to keep in mind is that you want to make sure that the top of your foam block is also worked on and textured, with a few indentations every now and then. Nothing gives away it being just a block of foam, like a perfectly straight edge, unless of course you plan to add some extra sand and foliage to it later on. There's also always an option to leave a nice flat plateau then, but in general, if you're just making a rock formation, I would avoid it. And this is what the whole thing ends up looking like after you're done cutting and carving away in it. It's still got some very deep nashes every now and then, but we're going to fix that with the next stage. And this next stage consists of just using some cheap wall filler and a disposable cup. And the reason why I use the cup is to take some of that wall filler and then thin it down with a bit of water, so it becomes more easy to brush onto your rock formation. Here I am adding a bit of water with a pipette, just so you can thin it down a bit. And as you can see, you sort of end up with a goop at this stage that you can work more easily onto the model. And it's just a case of getting a bit of an older brush that you now work into all of the crevices. And like this big gash that I had made when cutting the foam will be mostly filled up with it. Now, of course, you don't want to go and put this on too thickly, just so you don't end up, undoing all of the texture you've got on here. This is sort of an artist's eye of where you have to do away with some of the deep gashes and where you want to have a nice thin texture to it. This wall filler is gonna dry up to be a bit coarse and grainy, but that's exactly the sort of thing we want for our paint to hang on to when we get to that stage. And after it's all dried up, this is roughly the sort of texture you end up with. Now at this stage, that wall filler is incredibly brittle and fragile. Now if you've made any unsightly blobs to it, you can remove them and rub them off with your finger, like I'm doing here. Now in order to seal all of this, I'm applying a mixture of Mod Podge and black paint that I have ready mixed in the pot, and I'm applying it with that same brush that you don't mind getting damaged a bit. Now if you don't have Mod Podge, I advise you to just get a bit of PVA glue, mix it with some black acrylic paint, some cheap craft paint if you have it, and just water it down until you get to a consistency that flows well, but is still reasonably thick, because it is sort of meant to be a primer and a sealant all in one go. And you do want it to be runny enough to run into all of the smooth, the cracks that you've made and not leave any of the foam showing through. But you don't want it that thin that you are going to have to apply multiple coats of it, because that sort of also does away with the intended purpose of this coat. I always work about halfway through one of these things and just let it dry, set it aside until it is done, and then when it is done I just work on the other side. And as you can see, there's nothing subtle about applying this paint, it's just a case of stabbing it on and just making sure that it gets in all of the nooks and crannies. You do want to leave these things to dry out for a while until you can get to the painting stage. Now, I'm showing you what colors I have used, but it really doesn't matter all that much. I always just start with my rocks with a dark green-grayish color, and then have a light green-gray. Coincidentally, Vallejo model color actually has a color called that way, as the main highlight color. And because rocks are seldom just grey, I also get a bit of acrylic ochre color and a dark red brownish to go along with it. Now the first one that we have to slap on is that dark green grey. In this case it was Crick's Bane base coat, I think it was. Doesn't really matter as long as it's sort of greenish, because especially for what I'm designing it for, it's going to be standing in a sea and you can expect some of the green stuff to be on there. Next up, I take my green-grey type of paint and just mix in a little. I work it into the bristles, but I don't clean up the brush completely though. I want to sort of drag it across the surface as a very heavy-handed overbrush / dry brush, whatever you want to call it really. Just want to make sure that some of that green is still showing through and that you get some very harsh transitions at this stage. But we're going to be working on those in just a bit. And just go around dry brushing the entire thing, and over brushing I should say, until you're happy with it. Now another thing you can do is just stipple on some of that green-grey as well, just to intensify the colour a bit. I do this on some very protruding edges of the rock formations, because it will create some natural highlights, and you even get that sort of airbrushed on appearance if you do so. And it's very easy to do. You just take your same brush and just stab at it in the corners. You fill some more of the pits made of the texture, and you create some more natural and smoother highlights doing so. Now this is of course not buttery smooth, but it's not supposed to be. It's a rock. Now once you've done all of that, I just take a bit of a blob of the ochre paint and the dark reddish brown color, and I create washes out of it using the exact same brush that I had earlier. You just do that by applying a lot of water, and I don't care if one color runs into the next, because as you'll see, that's exactly the point. Now I'll apply this ochre color more or less completely around the entire model. It's just to give it a sort of a vague yellowish tint that you quite often find in rocks, and I just do this across the whole model. And when it's still wet, I just quickly swap over with the same brush, doesn't matter, to the reddish paint, and I just start dabbing on some spots on there as well. Just let all of it run together as it sees fit, and you sort of get a leopard's pattern that way. And yeah, it's just to add a bit of visual interest to the rock. And once all of it is dry, this is essentially what you are left with. Now it is a bit of a patchy mess at this stage, but once you start applying the next wash and the next dry brush, that's going to bind all of it together. Now the final wash that we'll be doing is a black wash, and again, it's just a bit of black craft paint that I mix with a lot of water into a different palette, and I'm going to be applying this all over the rock. This being a wash, it means it runs into all of the little crevices, of course, and you can be fairly heavy-handed with the application of this. You don't have to worry about undoing all of your work with the ochre and red wash, because we're going to do a bit of cheating here by just applying it, letting it run down, and then quickly grabbing a bit of tissue paper and then dabbing the excess wash off, just so you don't get any horrible blobs all over your rock. And the wash sort of stays where it needs to be in those deeper cuts that you've made. And you can just do this going around all of the model while it's still wet, and at the end of it you're sort of left with this. Now I just let that dry overnight, and yeah, at the end of it you're sort of left with this starting to look more like a realistic rock at this stage. Now the final thing that it needs is a few highlights, and for that I'm just getting some, again, rather cheap acrylic craft paint, this time by Winsor & Newton, titanium white. And I grab a brush with some soft bristles. I also make sure I have a bit of toilet paper on hand, and I start working the white paint into the bristles. Now in this situation we're aiming for a dry brush, not an overbrush, so you really do want to work all of that paint into the toilet paper as much as possible, and have a similar backup by rubbing it across the back of your hand to make sure you don't have too much paint in it. And it's just a case of gently wiping it off with those soft bristles across the whole rock formation until you're done with it. And that's essentially what you end up with these simple steps. The process is very easy to do, and you can easily knock out a battlefield like this in a day or two. Now if you like this sort of content and you want to see some more easy to do hobby projects, make sure you give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel as well. One of the final things that I end up doing is applying a bit of sand to the areas which I'm going like, well, that's a bit flat, so you might get some sand accumulation on those, and that's simply done with some PVA glue. And this is the final effect that you get. Thank you very much for listening to the video, and I hope you learned something from it, and I hope to see you the next time. Bye!